Hello and welcome to Let's Read The Village of Stepanchikovo by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is an audio presentation of the novel with occasional clarifying commentary from me, the reader. Now, if you want to jump straight to the action, feel free to skip ahead to the next video in this playlist. To access the playlist itself, check out the video description below. Otherwise, stick around and I'll explain the nature of this project a bit further while providing some background material on the story. The basic purpose of this Let's Read is to make the literature as accessible as it can be in an audio format. Typically, when you read classical literature in print, you have a host of advantages that you do not have in a conventional audiobook. You might have an introduction from a literary scholar. You may have notes that provide relevant background information that would tend to be lost on a modern audience. You have time to sit and absorb complicated developments in the plot, or to sort out a complicated cast of characters, and so on. In a conventional audiobook, by contrast, you simply get the spoken text rolling on. But not in this audiobook. Here I wish to read through the novel with you, but will retain the license to add comments where I think it may be helpful to a general audience. In just a moment, I will provide some introductory background information on the novel. When completed, this Let's Read will also contain some concluding thoughts on the book, but it will also have some notes sprinkled throughout the reading, simply to clarify points that the average listener could easily miss. I will do my best to keep a light hand and to allow the text to stand on its own. But there will be cases where it will be useful to sum up events or to identify references, and so you will be hearing my comments every so often just to make sure you don't get lost. I will reserve my own analysis and reactions to the text for the final video of this sequence. Now, I expect to complete this project in two formats. Currently, you are viewing this Let's Read as part of a YouTube playlist, and I will start making these videos available to the public when I'm around a third of the way through the recording. However, in the end, I expect to assemble all the parts of this Let's Read as a single video for the benefit of search engines outside of the YouTube environment. If that's your preference, expand the description below, and you will likely have a link to that single video. If you are keeping it here, our next item of business is an introduction to the novel itself. First off, the village of Stepanchikovo is in the public domain. The version we will be reading has been translated by Constance Garnett, and it is available for download in PDF format from archive.org. as one of two works in the volume The Novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky. In this edition, the work is just over 200 pages long. Two quick notes on this version. First, this volume is distinct from the book The Short Novels of Dostoevsky, which is also available from the same site. Our novel appears in each of these volumes, but I find the PDF file for The Novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky to be much more legible. Second, the village of Stepanchikovo often goes by an alternative title, The Friend of the Family. That is how it is labeled in the volume I will be using. The village of Stepanchikovo, or The Friend of the Family, was written in the late 1850s and published in 1859, while Dostoevsky was still in Siberia after his arrest on political charges in 1849. He had been released from the prison camp, but was now serving compulsory military duty and had not yet been cleared to return to Petersburg. He was eager to get back into the literary fold, however, and so worked on two projects at around the same time, the other being Uncle's Dream. Each of these short novels is pitched in a comic tone, and each was designed to be uncontroversial, and thus safe from the ire of the censor, at a time when the author was in no position to take political risks. Dostoevsky was never satisfied with Uncle's Dream, but he gradually warmed up to The Village of Stepanchikovo as he was writing it, and by the time he was done, considered it his best work to date. The critics at the time begged to differ. In fact, mostly they ignored it altogether. The reason was primarily that the Russian literary world had moved on since Dostoevsky's arrest in 1849. Other writers had command of the spotlight, including Ivan Turgenev in his prime, and a fresh young talent named Leo Tolstoy. The political world was shifting, with a new Tsar in power, and with him the promise of the emancipation of the serfs. The literatis' attention was fixed on issues surrounding social change. While Dostoevsky was certainly not inured to these developments, he was not immersed in them, nor could he afford to be in his precarious political situation. Today, The Village of Stepanchikovo remains a relatively obscure work in the Dostoevsky canon, and it lies in the shadow of his best stuff, which would emerge in the following 2 decades. We don't typically think of Dostoevsky as a comedic writer, but rather recall his tragic novels with brooding metaphysical speculation and psychological torment. But the man had some skill with comedy that he never lost sight of, even if his comic moments typically have a nasty bite to them, and by 1859 he had already tried his hand at it several times. Of his comedic works, this is probably the best, and certainly the most ambitious. The novel divides into 2 parts, each of which narrates the events of a single day. Most of the action takes place at the manor house of an obscure village, and the movement of the plot is carried by dialogue. These features have suggested that the novel may have been originally conceived as a play for the theater, and in fact it was adapted for the stage in the early 20th century, after Dostoevsky's death. The story is told from the perspective of a young university graduate who comes to visit his uncle at his estate in a provincial village at his uncle's request. When he arrives, he discovers that his uncle, who is presumably the master of the house, is actually living under the thumb of a no-name sponger who has managed to ingratiate himself into the favor of the uncle's mother and has surprisingly gained despotic control of the estate. The affairs are complicated by a number of subplots and conflicts, several of which involve romantic intrigue, until events finally reach their resolution. In fact, the plot of The Village of Stepanchikovo is probably the most complicated of any of Dostoevsky's works of the 1840s and 1850s, and it anticipates the kind of intricacy we will see in his full-length novels of the 1860s and 70s. But Dostoevsky's primary interest in the novel is not on its plot development, but upon his 2 principal characters. In an enthusiastic letter to his brother, in which he describes his most recent project, Dostoevsky gushes that, quote, "It contains 2 immensely typical characters, created and noted down over a 5-year period, worked out flawlessly, in my opinion, characters entirely Russian and only badly presented up to now in Russian literature." Unquote. Those characters are the uncle and presumed master of the estate, Colonel Yegor Ilyich Rostanev, and his tyrant, Foma Fomich Opiskin. The former is a rough draft of a character type that Dostoevsky would work on again and again in the coming decades, the perfectly good man. I do have to emphasize the word rough. Colonel Rostanev is thoroughly eclipsed by later iterations of this type in novels such as The Idiot or The Brothers Karamazov. But he seems to represent the origin of this idea, and so he warrants close observation. But the star of the show is surely Foma Fomitch. The man really needs to be seen to be believed, and so I won't say much more about him here, other than to note some details about the source material. The idea of a conniving outsider who worms his way into a position of power over a family was earlier developed in Molière's famous 17th century play, Tartuffe. Dostoevsky was certainly familiar with this play, and even references it in an earlier story, and many people will refer to Foma Fomitch as a sort of Russian Tartuffe. But there was another source too, and not a fictional one, but a real one. Nikolai Gogol, one of Dostoevsky's primary literary inspirations in his early career. Much of Dostoevsky's early stuff does homage to the man. Poor Folk is loosely based on his story, The Overcoat, and Gogol's satirical touch is emulated at times in The Double and in some of his short stories. But in 1847, with his creative career in decline, Gogol also published Selected Passages from Correspondence with My Friends, which offered a surprisingly conservative defense of the social status quo and combined it with condescending and preachy prescriptions about religious virtues and the improvement of the moral lives of the serfs. Most everybody at the time reacted with hostility to this work. In the village of Stepanchikovo, Dostoevsky has his villain, Foma Fomitch, repeating many of Gogol's ideas in selected passages, and so appears to be turning his guns on his former literary idol. I may say more about this issue in my concluding comments. A third character who deserves scrutiny is the narrator. For reasons that I will make clear later, I think of the narrator as being somewhat related to Dostoevsky himself, and his development in the course of the story will echo the changes that we are beginning to see in the author's own ideas. When we put them together, these three figures offer a revealing glimpse into the trajectory of the author's career. Quite apart from being an entertaining tale with a compelling villain, the village of Stepanchikovo gives us a window into where Dostoevsky has been and where he is going. Now, before we begin, I need to address two quick items of housekeeping, and then offer a reference for future use. First off, the characters in the novel will sometimes slip into French, and occasionally there will be a piece of wordplay in the Russian that can get lost in translation. Where I can, I will provide the needed translation or explanation visually on the screen. This is one more way in which the medium of YouTube provides an advantage over a conventional audiobook. Second, I should say a word about Russian naming conventions. Russian names have three parts: a first name and a surname, but in between the two a patronymic, which contains the first name of the individual's father, followed by an ich or an ovna, depending on the sex. Sometimes the character will be referred to by his last name, sometimes by the first name and patronymic, and sometimes by the first name alone, or by a nickname. So, for instance, one of our main characters is Yegor Ilyich Rostanev. His daughter's name is Alexandra Yegorovna Rostanev, or Alexandra, daughter of Yegor. Since she is just a girl, she will often be referred to informally by a nickname, Sasha or Sashenka. But since she is also 15 and growing into a young lady, sometimes she will be referred to more formally as Alexandra Yegorovna. Incidentally, Yegor Ilyich's son's name is Ilyusha. By looking at the names of father and son, we can infer that Ilyusha was named after his grandfather. And speaking of names, this brief novel contains a lot of them, about as many as you would expect in one of Dostoevsky's later full-length novels. So I thought it would be handy to have a Dramatis personae for your reference. It isn't an exhaustive list, but it contains the main players. To my mind, you may safely forget the characters who do not appear in this catalogue. First off, we have our narrator, Sergei Alexandrovich, who is the newcomer to the scenes at Stepanchikovo. We never do learn his surname. His uncle will affectionately call him Seryozha. The household at Stepanchikovo has several members, and they basically divide into two camps. On the one side, we have the narrator's uncle, Colonel Yegor Ilyich Rostanev. At the time our novel opens, he is a widower. His late wife, we discover later, was named Katya. He has two children. The eldest is Alexandra Yegorovna, or Sasha, or Sashenka. His youngest is Ilyusha, a boy of 8. His middle-aged sister, a meek woman who has never married, also lives with him. Her name is Praskovya Ilyinichna. Then there is the other side of the household. The colonel's mother is named Agafia Timofeyevna Krahotkin, although usually she is referred to as Madame la Générale. That is because her greatest accomplishment in life is to have gotten married to one General Krahotkin as her second husband, who is deceased by the time the plot proper begins. Her favorite companion, and her de facto master, is Foma Fomich Opiskin, and her favorite toady is Anna Nilovna Perepelitsyn, a spinster who prides herself on being the daughter of a major. Foma Fomich and Mademoiselle Perepelitsyn both live in the house. Next we have the staff. There are many names here, but the dominant ones include Vidoplyasov, an eccentric footman, Gavrila, an elderly, loyal servant, and Falale, a simple-minded boy who is a favorite of Madame la Générale. These three are all serfs. But for the purposes of our story, the most important worker on the estate is a free woman, serving as the young governess of the two children. Her name is Nastasia Yevgrafovna Yezhevikin, usually just called Nastenka or Nastya. Nastenka is the daughter of a former civil servant who is now desperately poor and out of work. His name is Yevgraf Larionich Yezhevikin, and he is one of several visitors to the estate. A wealthy visitor is Stepan Alexievich Batcheyev, a portly and excitable landowner of a neighboring estate. Then there is the young Pavel Semyonich Obnoskin and his mother Anfisa Petrovna, who are visiting from the town. Their surname offers a handy mnemonic. These two are fairly obnoxious. And there is the enigmatic Ivan Ivanich Mezinchikov, a young distant relation who has run out of his money and is borrowing from the colonel. Another figure under the colonel's care is a middle-aged woman named Tatiana Ivanovna. She is wealthy, but is also a bit unstable mentally, and so is in need of a guardian. Finally, we hear early on about a man named Korovkin, a person who has made the acquaintance of the colonel, and whom the colonel considers a man of learning. So there you have it, 21 names to keep straight. You will surely forget this roster within the next 5 minutes, but hopefully you will find it handy to make reference to it later on. The good news is that these characters are introduced fairly gradually as the novel proceeds, and so attentive listeners will hopefully find it natural to follow Who's Who. But we are now ready for the curtain to rise. So sit back and enjoy The Village of Stepanchikovo.